Narborough is a peaceful and safe village in Leicestershire, England. However, this place is associated with a single murder that happened in 1983, shocking the whole community. The victim was Linda Mann, a 15-year-old girl living in Narborough. She attended Lutterworth Grammar School and Community College. Linda was Susan Mann's younger sister, 2 years older than her. After her marriage broke down, their mother, Kathleen Mann, moved to Narborough and married Edward Eastwood in 1980, when Susan was 14 and Linda was 12. Linda was described as a typical teenage girl, gentle, friendly, and well-liked. She loved school, always had fun with her friends, and had no problems with adolescence. Linda was passionate about exploring the world around her, passionate about music, fashion, makeup, and hairdressing. When she couldn't afford clothes, she babysat to earn extra money and even made her dresses. On the evening of November 21, 1983, Linda left home to visit a friend but never arrived. She had promised her mother and stepfather that she would return by 10 p.m., but she had not been seen by midnight. Worried, Kathleen and Edward immediately called the police. They searched for Linda all night in vain. The following day at 7:20 a.m., on his way to work, a hospital employee named Porter discovered a body on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just a discarded mannequin, but the truth was much more horrifying. It was Linda Mann. She had been attacked and strangled. Her jeans had been pulled down, and her clothes were strewn everywhere. A scarf was wrapped around her neck, the very instrument that took Linda's life. When news of the murder spread, the entire village was gripped by fear. Young women were advised to travel in groups to avoid danger. The police immediately launched an investigation. They searched the entire area around the crime scene, but found no valuable clues. A local psychiatric hospital was just a few hundred meters away, leading many to suspect that the killer might have been a patient there. However, there was no evidence to support this theory. An autopsy revealed that a man's DNA was on Linda's body. The trace belonged to an individual with blood type A, meaning that about 10% of adult males in the UK could be a suspect. The police took a blood sample from Edward Eastwood for testing, but the results confirmed that he did not belong to that 10% group, eliminating Edward as a suspect. The case remains a heartbreaking mystery with no answers. The police launched a massive investigation. One team of investigators scoured Narborough, knocking on doors for clues. Meanwhile, another team compiled a list of all the other perpetrators in Leicestershire, tracked them down, and questioned them individually. One day, the police received a mysterious call. The caller claimed to have seen a young man with spiky hair at around 8 p.m., just 2 minutes' walk from where Linda's body was found. This seemed like a significant clue, but unfortunately, the young man's identity was never established. 3 long years passed, and investigators continued to search for the killer, but the case remained a mystery. In 1986, terror swept Leicestershire again. Dawn Ashworth, a 15-year-old girl, lived in Enderby with her parents and brother, Andrew. Dawn was a talented girl who loved to paint and worked part-time at a newspaper agency. On July 31, 1986, Dawn left work at 4 p.m. and visited a friend in Narborough. She was told to be home by 7 p.m., but by 9:40 p.m., she had not returned. Dawn's parents were panicking, driving around Narborough looking for their daughter, but no matter how many streets they visited or how many times they called, they could not find her. In their utmost fear, they called the police. One question haunted them. Would their daughter suffer the same fate as Linda Mann? A few days later, police discovered Dawn Ashworth's body in a field near 10-Pound Lane. The scene was horrific. Dawn had been attacked and strangled, just like Linda Mann had 3 years earlier. Forensics quickly revealed a chilling truth. The male DNA collected from Dawn's body matched that of Linda's. This confirmed that the same killer had killed both girls. But the similarities didn't stop there. Both murders had taken place on the pavement. Both victims were teenage girls walking alone. Their bodies were found in similar circumstances. Linda and Dawn had both attended Lutterworth Grammar School and Community College. The police immediately set up a mobile incident response station at 10-Pound Lane, where people could come forward with information. They received around 200 calls, and dozens came forward to share what they knew. A promising detail emerged. A red motorcycle was seen parked under a highway bridge near the crime scene. Several witnesses reported seeing a young man wearing a red helmet around the area around 5 p.m. on the day of the crime. Even more curiously, just a day after Dawn went missing, but a day before police found her body, a female police officer and a detective encountered a young man on a red motorcycle wearing a red helmet, acting suspiciously while watching the police search. As police patrol near the Carlton Hayes Psychiatric Hospital, they are approached by a kitchen worker. The young man, just 17, claims to have seen Dawn Ashworth on the day she disappeared. The clues are starting to come together, but will the police find the killer before he strikes again? The police plan to meet Richard Buckland again to take a further statement. But before they could question him again, an incredibly valuable piece of information came into the incident room. The source of the information came from a kitchen worker at Carlton Hayes Hospital, a friend of Porter's. On the day Dawn Ashworth went missing, the friend was on holiday, but he had still come to the hospital to collect his paycheck. That evening at 10 o'clock, Porter visited and happily informed him that Dawn's body had been found, hidden in a hedge near the M1 bridge gate. However, a suspicious detail emerged. The friend's father overheard the conversation and asked Porter how he knew this information, since there had been no reports of Dawn's case on TV at the time. Porter's answer was chilling. "Someone told me." Then he casually revealed a gruesome detail. Her body was hanging from a tree. But there was a big problem. Dawn Ashworth was not hanging from a tree. Her body was found hidden under branches and other debris inside a gate that leads from 10-Pound Lane to a field, just a 10-minute walk from the M1 bridge. The question is, how did Porter know exactly where Dawn's body was found more than 12 hours before the police discovered it? Once investigators pieced together the pieces, they arrested Porter. His true identity was Richard Buckland. He was taken to Wigston Police Station for questioning. Buckland made inconsistent statements, but admitted that he had seen Dawn on the day of her disappearance and had spoken to her. However, as the investigation progressed, the holes in his story became more apparent. At one point, Buckland suddenly confessed everything, but he quickly recanted. During a third interview, Buckland gave a detailed confession containing previously undisclosed details about the crime scene. This led investigators to believe that he had murdered Dawn, and possibly Linda Mann. But was it true? As Buckland prepared to go to trial, Dawn's family was still grieving. 4 weeks after her disappearance, they held a funeral for her in the small cemetery behind St. John the Baptist Church in Enderby. In his eulogy, the minister described Dawn as a bright, lively young woman, loyal to her family and full of life. More than 200 people came to the cemetery to say goodbye, their hearts heavy with the irreparable loss. Meanwhile, investigators continued to build their case against Buckland. They heard about a new scientific method that could help identify the killer, DNA testing. Could this cutting-edge technology help uncover the truth and bring the real killer to light? Although no one had ever used the technology in a murder case, the police believed they could try a revolutionary method: DNA testing. All the samples from the 2 crime scenes were sent to Dr. Alec Jeffreys, a young geneticist at the University of Leicestershire. He had just announced a groundbreaking discovery: genetic fingerprinting, a technology that could identify people based on DNA samples. However, Dr. Jeffreys was uncertain whether his method could do what investigators wanted. He had previously applied the technique only to an immigration case and a paternity dispute, but never to identify a murderer. This would be the first time in history that DNA testing had been used in a criminal case, and all eyes were on the results. The entire investigation team was stunned when the test results returned. The DNA did not match Richard Buckland. This meant that Buckland was utterly innocent. He had not killed Linda Mann. But even more shocking was that he had not been involved in Dawn Ashworth's death. Even so, the test confirmed something important. The same killer had committed both crimes. This meant that the killer was still at large. Richard Buckland became the first person in history to be exonerated by DNA testing. After 3 months in custody, he was released, and the investigation was back to square one. Inspector Derek Pierce was assigned to continue the investigation. He read through the 1,800 reports sent to the police by the public. One of the messages mentioned a man who had appeared during the Linda Mann investigation. The man was suspected of having a sexual problem with a previous conviction for indecent assault. Still, he had previously been ruled out as a suspect because he had only moved to the village a month after Linda's murder. The message the police received read, "You should investigate a man in Little Thorpe called Colin Pitchfork." Although many men were under suspicion, from those with previous convictions to those anonymously reported by wives, girlfriends, or neighbors, Colin Pitchfork stood out strangely. The police decided to try an unprecedented method. They asked every man in the village aged 17 to 34 who did not have an alibi to volunteer to submit blood and saliva samples for DNA testing. The notice was published on the 2nd of January 1987, and the first mass DNA testing campaign in history began. Inspector Pierce did not believe the real killer would volunteer, but he hoped he would somehow make a mistake. By the end of January, more than 1,000 men had been tested. However, only a quarter of the samples had been processed, and the forensic lab was quickly overwhelmed. This made the police realize that the testing process could take longer than the original 2 months. By May 1987, the number of people who had submitted DNA tests had reached 3,653, but due to the enormous workload, only 2,000 had been ruled out as suspects. Investigators continued to search for the killer, but time passed without any breakthroughs. On September 18, 1987, the police received a fateful call. A woman reported that she had overheard a suspicious conversation at the Clarendon pub in Leicester. In a group of friends chatting, a man named Ian Kelly loudly announced that he had taken a blood test on behalf of a friend. The police immediately reviewed the file of Colin Pitchfork, a name that had appeared on the list of suspects. They discovered many unusual details in his relationship history. Pitchfork was a womanizer, having had many extramarital affairs despite being married to Carol Pitchfork. Even more suspicious, Pitchfork's signature on the test form did not match his signature on other documents, indicating that someone else had taken the test for him. On September 19, 1987, Inspector Derek Pierce visited Ian Kelly, a baker who worked with Pitchfork. Ian initially denied the whole thing, but then panicked and admitted that Pitchfork had manipulated him into taking the blood test. Ian recounted that Pitchfork feared the police would suspect him based on his history of bragging and suspicious behavior. So he convinced Ian to impersonate him and provide a blood sample instead. Later that day, investigators arrived at Colin Pitchfork's house. Detective Mick Thomas confronted him and said, "We believe you murdered Dawn Ashworth on July 31st, 1986. We also believe someone else did the blood test for you. You're going to be arrested, do you understand?" Pitchfork didn't object. His face said it all. He knew the game was up. Even when his wife, Carol Pitchfork, entered the room and learned what had happened, she attacked her husband, screaming in rage. The police were slow to stop her, as if they wanted Pitchfork to pay immediately. At the police station, Pitchfork finally confessed everything. He said he had initially intended to tease Linda Mann, but things got out of hand when he realized she could identify him. After committing the crime, he calmly returned to the car, where his wife and child were tied to the seats, and drove home as if nothing had happened. With Dawn Ashworth, he repeated the same action. He knew what he was doing, but he couldn't stop. To cover up the evidence, he even tried to kill Ian Kelly several times, but each time he failed. On January 22, 1988, Colin Pitchfork, 28, appeared at Leicester Crown Court. Ian Kelly was sentenced to 18 months and suspended for 2 years, meaning he did not have to serve jail time. When he walked out of the courtroom, he faced the media and said only one regretful sentence: "I was wrong. I apologize to everyone I hurt." Pitchfork, wearing jeans and a short-sleeved shirt, calmly admitted to the murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. He was sentenced to 2 life terms, much to the surprise of investigators. However, the sentence did not include a recommended minimum term, meaning he could have been released after 10 or 12 years, a fact that outraged police. Linda Mann's stepfather, Eddie Eastwood, recalled the moment to Pitchfork. "He just stared at me as if to say, 'Well, what happened to you?' I couldn't understand him. He looked almost human." Linda's mother, Kathleen Mann, recalled the shock of seeing the photos of her daughter's body. "I couldn't look. When the photos were shown in court, the whole courtroom went silent. My brother saw them and started crying. Luckily, I didn't raise my head." She insisted, "He should never have been freed. He should have been hanged." DNA fingerprinting technology has revolutionized criminal investigation. No more wrongful convictions and false confessions. DNA has become the most potent weapon in bringing criminals to justice. However, one mystery remains. How did Richard Buckland, a wrongly arrested man, know so many details about Dawn Ashworth's crime scene? Police believe he accidentally discovered Dawn's body on his way to work. Still, because he was considered the village idiot, he was pressured into confessing to crimes he did not commit. The cases of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth not only changed the lives of those involved, but also marked a turning point in forensic history, a turning point that has brought justice to countless victims in the years since. Jeffrey's Debbie Davis was born in Lynchburg, Virginia on July 15, 1952. After completing her studies, she entered a short-lived marriage, which unfortunately ended in divorce. Debbie then moved to Richmond, Virginia, with her cousin Judy Fisk. The two settled in an apartment on Devonshire Street, located in the Westover Hills neighborhood. In 1985, Debbie began working as an account manager at Style Weekly, a Richmond-based media outlet. She is a pop culture enthusiast, especially fond of Bruce Springsteen's music. She also acted as an extra in the HBO film Finnegan Begin Again. Outside of her main job, Debbie is a devoted reader of mystery novels. She spent a few nights a week working at the Walden bookstore in the Cloverleaf Mall in Chesterfield County to satisfy her passion for books. On the evening of September 18, 1987, Debbie and her coworker Deanna Hoff decided to take a quick trip to Virginia Beach. They were excited to attend a Dana Carvey performance. After the performance, Deanna drove Debbie back to her apartment. When they arrived, Deanna waited until Debbie was safely inside before leaving. Little did she know that this would be the last time she would see Debbie alive. The following day, a man named Arnold Ellis noticed a Renault Alliance parked in front of his house. Strangely, the engine was still running and the keys were still in the ignition, but there was no sign of the driver. Feeling uneasy, Arnold Ellis called the police. Upon checking, they determined that the car belonged to Debbie Davis, who lived just down the street. A police officer knocked on her door but received no response. At this point, an elderly neighbor approached and handed the police the apartment key. Inside the apartment, the scene was haunting. Debbie was lying face down on the bed, shirtless, wearing only a pair of cut-off jean shorts. Her right arm was tied behind her back with a thick shoelace, while her left arm was pinned beneath her body. Around her neck, a black stocking was tied tightly. Debbie had been strangled to death and brutally attacked. Investigators discovered that the killer had broken into Debbie Davis's home deliberately. He had taken a rocking chair from a nearby porch and propped it up under the kitchen window to climb inside. Near Debbie's bed on the nightstand was a detective novel called Presumed Innocent. The book told of a woman who was tied up and murdered, much like Debbie's tragic death. Police quickly realized that the killer was brilliant, experienced, and knew how to cover his tracks. He left no fingerprints or witnesses and didn't take anything. Detective Ray Williams, who was in charge of the case, shared, "It's rare for a killer to be so brutal and leave no clues, but he did." The case left the community in shock. Lorna Wyckoff, the founder of Style Weekly, where Debbie had worked, offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to the killer's arrest. However, the police could not find anyone suspicious in Debbie's life. She lived a quiet life, not dating, not being involved in drugs or bars, and not seeing her ex-husband for years. However, just 2 weeks later, Richmond was rocked by another murder. Susan Elizabeth Helms was born in Charleston, South Carolina, on February 6, 1955. She moved to Richmond, Virginia, to pursue a medical career and interned at the Medical College of Virginia, specializing in neurosurgery. Susan married Marcel Slagg, and the two bought a house in Woodland Heights, a quiet, peaceful neighborhood in Richmond. But on the night of October 3, 1987, everything changed forever. Marcel returned home around 1:45 a.m. When he entered, he heard noises upstairs. Thinking it was Susan, he quietly took a shower, then tiptoed into the bedroom. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the sight before him left him speechless. Susan lay motionless just outside the closet, her upper body naked, a red leather belt tightly around her neck. Her hands were tied behind her back with electrical cord and ties, just as Debbie had been. The bedroom window was wide open, and their house was less than a mile from where Debbie Davis had been murdered. Detective Ray Williams was on duty that night and was immediately dispatched to the scene. Upon closer inspection, he realized a chilling truth. The killer was still in the house when Marcel returned. Williams said, "Marcel heard noises upstairs, but it couldn't be Susan. She was dead. That means the killer is still out there." Outside the bedroom window on the balcony, the police found an open jar of Vaseline, which the killer had left behind. Investigation revealed that the Vaseline had been purchased at a store near the Cloverleaf Mall where Debbie had worked part-time. However, this trail did not lead to any clues. The community was in a state of panic. The police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, and public pressure forced them to act quickly. Detective Williams decided to check the financial records of the Walden bookstore, where Debbie had worked. During the inspection, he discovered a check written by Susan Helms, which Debbie had endorsed on the back. Was this just a coincidence, or was there a mysterious connection between the two victims? Before Williams could find the answer, another horrific crime occurred. Diane Cho was born in 1972 in South Korea. Her family immigrated to the United States in 1984 and lived in Richmond for only 5 months when tragedy struck. At age 15, Diane was an honor student at Manchester High School. She was a rock for her parents, who spoke little English. In October 1987, Diane told a friend about a recurring nightmare. "I always dream about a strange man following me. But what's scarier is that sometimes I see him in real life." Diane said she had seen the man in the mall many times. One night in November 1987, Diane went to the movies at Cloverleaf Mall with a friend. They bought tickets to The Princess Bride. But as soon as they got to the parking lot, Diane began shaking with fear. "He's there! He's staring at us!" Diane pointed to a man in the parking lot. No one knows if Diane told her parents about the stalker. On the night of November 21, 1987, Diane's parents returned to the apartment around 9 p.m. Her mother cut Diane's hair, and the family went to bed. Around midnight, they could still hear the keyboards clacking in Diane's room. She was working on her English essay. The next day around 2 p.m., Diane's parents called home to remind her to prepare for church. Her brother Roman, 12, answered and said Diane was still asleep. When Diane's parents got home an hour later, her mother walked into the bedroom to wake her. The door opened. She screamed in despair. Diane Cho was found in her bedroom, bound, strangled, and assaulted. Her window was open, a familiar sight in previous cases. The police had a clear pattern for the killer, but before they could find the trail, another victim appeared. Sue Tucker, 44, lived in Arlington County, Virginia in November 1987. She was an editor for the United States Department of Agriculture magazine. Her husband, Reg Tucker, had been a Fairfax County Public Schools photographer, but in early 1987 he moved to Wales to teach photography. Sue planned to sell her house and finish her work so she could join her husband. Ironically, they left the United States because they feared the growing violence. But before they could carry out their plan, a tragedy occurred. Sue's neighbor, Audrey Seislove, became concerned when she could not reach Sue for several days. While observing Sue's home, she noticed that the bedroom window had remained open for several days. Fearing that something was wrong, Audrey went in to check. Immediately, a foul odor hit her, a strong, acrid smell like decomposing flesh. She called the police immediately, and when they arrived, the scene inside was horrifying. Sue Tucker's body was lying in her bed, badly decomposed. She had been tied up with nylon rope, strangled, and assaulted, all in the same manner as the previous cases. Upon further investigation, the police discovered that the killer had entered through the window of the small laundry room in the basement. Before leaving, he had even calmly eaten a snack, leaving a half-eaten orange on the dining table, a chilling act demonstrating confidence and lack of haste. While the police were still on the scene, the phone rang. Reg Tucker had been trying to reach his wife for days without getting a response. Police had to break the terrible news to him by phone. Arlington County investigators found striking similarities between Sue's murder and a January 1984 case. The victim, Carolyn Hamm, a 32-year-old lawyer, was found bound and strangled not far from where Sue Tucker lived. The perpetrator of the 1984 case was identified as David Vasquez, a fast food worker with a low IQ. Vasquez confessed to the crime and is serving a 35-year sentence. But if Vasquez was in prison, how could the identical crimes continue to occur nearly 4 years later? Detective Joe Horgus, the lead investigator on Sue Tucker's case, decided to go to the prison to interview David Vasquez. The crime motifs were too similar. The victim's hands were tied behind his back. A rope was tied around his neck. An attack. But after the interrogation, Detective Horgus was even more confident of one thing: David Vasquez was utterly innocent. When police in Arlington and Richmond compared information, they realized a shocking truth. In 1987, Richmond had a serial killer who was attacking women in their own homes. But before that, in 1983 and 1984, Arlington County had a crazy who committed similar crimes, which meant they were the same person? It all started in Arlington in June 1983 with the kidnapping and assault of a woman in the Green Valley area. The perpetrator was a black man in his late teens or early 20s, wearing a homemade mask. Over the next 7 months, he escalated his crimes, abducting women from their cars, breaking into homes through unlocked windows, bounding victims with nylon cords cut from their Venetian blinds. Police called him a one-man crime wave. In January 1984, an Arlington woman came home to find signs of forced entry. Her Venetian blind cords had been cut and left on her bed. The killer had waited for her to come home but had given up. Just 4 days later, Carolyn Hamm was found murdered, bound, and strangled in her garage. Arlington police quickly arrested David Vasquez and charged him. The problem was that Vasquez did not match the description of any of the victims. But even so, after his arrest, the attacks abruptly stopped. So the police believed they had the killer. But it was only after Sue Tucker was murdered that investigators realized they had the wrong man. The real killer only paused briefly, then resumed his crimes in Richmond. Detective Horgus received a telegram from the Richmond police in which they described the same strangulations: Debbie Davis, Susan Helms, Diane Cho. After collating all the information, investigators came to an undeniable conclusion. The perpetrator of all the murders from 1983 to 1987 was just one person. He may even have killed Carolyn Hamm, meaning David Vasquez was wrongly convicted. But while police have pieced together the crime, they have yet to find the real killer. Will the serial killer be caught before he strikes again? Police are scrambling to investigate, knowing they are racing against time. The FBI believed the killer would not stop voluntarily unless he were arrested for another crime in the time between the murders of Carolyn Hamm and Debbie Davis. As detectives pieced together the clues, one name popped up: Tommy Spencer. He was a juvenile with a burglary conviction dating back to the mid-1970s. Still more significantly, Spencer had been arrested in January 1984 for a break-in in Alexandria, right next to Arlington, where Carolyn Hamm was murdered. Even more chilling, he had been released from a Richmond correctional facility in 1987, just days before Debbie Davis was killed. Investigators immediately checked the correctional facility records and discovered something startling. Spencer signed his release papers each night of the murders. He had time to travel to Arlington the night Sue Tucker was murdered. This showed that Spencer was fully capable of committing the murders, but the police needed more substantial evidence. They decided to follow Spencer, hoping to catch him in the act. For more than 2 weeks, plainclothes officers secretly watched his every move. They discovered that Spencer had repeatedly violated his parole. He frequently slept overnight at his girlfriend's house instead of returning to prison. He spent hours hanging out at Cloverleaf Mall, which had been linked to 3 victims: Debbie Davis, Susan Helms, and Diane Cho. The police could not ignore this coincidence. After gathering enough evidence on January 20th, 1988, detectives from Arlington and Richmond simultaneously arrested Spencer. However, the biggest problem was there were no witnesses, no fingerprints. There is no direct evidence linking him to the crime scene. The police had only one option: to rely on a brand new forensic science, DNA fingerprinting. At the time, DNA testing had only been used in one cold case in England and had never been used in the United States. But this time, they decided to bet everything on this groundbreaking technology. It took more than 6 weeks, but finally, a private lab in New York came back with shocking results. Spencer's DNA matched exactly with DNA collected from the crime scenes of Debbie Davis, Susan Helms, Sue Tucker, and the Arlington attack victims. The police had irrefutable evidence. Timothy Spencer was the mysterious serial killer who had terrorized Richmond. In July 1988, Spencer went to trial. The trial lasted 6 days, and he was quickly found guilty. It was the first conviction in U.S. history based on DNA evidence, a revolutionary step in forensics. Spencer received multiple life sentences, but one issue remained unresolved. What about Carolyn Hamm and David Vasquez? Why was Vasquez convicted if he did not match the descriptions of any of the victims? David Vasquez first came under suspicion because Carolyn Hamm had complained that he had peeped on her while she was sunbathing just a week before she was killed. With his low IQ, Vasquez was easily manipulated by the police into giving a false confession. They revealed all the case details and then forced him to repeat them in his testimony. But when DNA proved that Timothy Spencer was the real killer, investigators immediately had strong doubts that Vasquez was innocent. DNA testing confirmed it. David Vasquez had nothing to do with the crime. He was released, becoming the first person in the United States to be exonerated by DNA. On the night of April 27, 1994, Timothy Wilson Spencer was taken to the Greensville Correctional Center, home to the infamous Old Sparky electric chair. Just minutes before 11 p.m., he was strapped into the chair, facing his inevitable end. With an electric current running through his body, Timothy Spencer was executed, ending his horrific crime spree.